what's your general take on some of this stuff going on? A lot of people are really worried, understandably. Some people are more optimistic, though. Some people are saying that, well, this is the start of a revolution. How are you feeling?
I think in terms of national politics, the Democrats are really losing the messaging battle, and the Republicans are winning the culture war right now. We have Donald Trump. We have tons of these fiery advocates for essentially far right populism, you could say fascism, who are coming out and saying the radical left is going to come destroy you, burn down your cities. And it's obviously crazy because we know Donald Trump is president and this is happening under his watch. And you could say it's escalated as a result of him being president. But it doesn't matter what your argument is. It matters that you have people and that you're there to actually make that argument. So Joe Biden spoke today in Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
but he needs to be speaking every day, or at least like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, on as many major networks as he can. And he needs to deliver strong messages, concise messaging, and he needs to make sure people have an out to the protesting and the civil unrest. Trump says he's going to resolve it with power. Biden needs to say, he's a law and order guy. He is a law and order guy from the crime bill, but he also needs to say, we will end the protesting by actually fixing the issues we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the big concerns that I've been having more recently is a kind of divergence between what voters will vote for and what like really turns out voters and the sorts of things which will actually fix the problems which are upsetting voters, right? We have a lot of alienated voters, people who are like, "Well, hold on, these two, the two parties aren't working for me. Nothing seems to be working for me. I vote for one guy, I vote for the other guy, and nothing seems to happen ever." Well, oftentimes it's the case that the things which are going to fix those problems aren't necessarily the kinds of things on which you can always run a campaign. And that's something that really worries me deeply about the state of our democracy and the state of our society and the prospect of developing any kind of international coalition, any kind of international system. And I do really genuinely find myself worrying about that. You mentioned Joe Biden talking about issues of law and order. One of the things that shocks me absolutely is that Donald Trump is able to run on this message of law and order, saying that he's going to get the cities back under control. Well, he is law and order right now. He's the president, damn it. But yet he's running around talking about how, oh, well, we need to, if Joe Biden gets in, your streets are going to be in chaos. There's going to be all these riots. There's going to all be all this looting. Well, hold on. There's all of those things that you're criticizing right now happening under your watch, but somehow you're the law and order guy. I mean, you seem to be the one who's sparking all of this, who's aggravating all this. But Donald Trump, of course, he wants to go out to Kenosha because that's going to help so much.
Yeah, and today you said you didn't see Biden's speech in Pittsburgh, but his one quote was, "You know me, you know my family. Do I look like a radical socialist?" And then he made the appeal that you just made that, Donald Trump is president right now. Biden says whether he knows it or not. So he's taking a cognitive shot at the thing that the
Right.
boomers like oh Trump can't remember things either. He takes a shot like that, and but yeah, it's all about reach too. Like the polling right now, and we were just talking about this. In battleground states at this point last election, Hillary Clinton was up 4.5 points. Right now, Joe Biden is only up 2.5 points. It's
Mm-hmm.
really an indicator, and if you've ever taken like a public speaking course or anything like that, the amount of influence that you're going to portray, the amount of people that agree with you, is going to depend on how good you are at selling a message. It doesn't matter if the RNC's message is completely void of reality. It matters that they're the ones giving the message. Right now, Democrats are just sitting back and they're doing the hiding strategy. I mean, just assuming Donald Trump is going to blow up,
Right.
but it's not happening. Now more Americans are appealing to this. They like this talk of, oh no, the country's falling apart, and they're believing the guy, like you said, who's in the White House right now, saying, if only he was president, this wouldn't be happening. But he is president.
Yeah, well, it was working for a long time, and I think that there is prospects for it to continue to work. This idea of hide in Joe Biden, basement Biden, but the thing about it is, in many respects, that's the reason why, and that's how Joe Biden had that monumentous lead back in late June, where he was absolutely clobbering in the polls, and he's still leading in the polls in many respects. His lead, I will say, you mentioned there that it's really been shrinking. The thing though is, it's Trump surging. It's not necessarily Biden dropping, which is a bit different than it was out in 2016. And the thing about that then is that there hasn't been the same kinds of ups and downs and major swings in this race compared to back in 2016. It seems like this one is much more stable. Voters who hate Trump, and they're going to be saying, well, I'm with Joe Biden. And, Joe Biden, as much as, you mentioned there that quote that I hadn't heard. Thank you for sharing it with me, that Joe Biden saying, oh, do I look like a radical socialist there? The thing about it, though, is Joe Biden distancing himself from socialism isn't going to be the thing that like wins him the election, right? I mean, I wish Joe Biden was more on the left, actively arguing for more leftist policies, because I think that would actually excite voters. Maybe he doesn't need to use the word socialism. I mean, we can have that debate, right? Some people think that's a good idea to use the word socialist. Some people think it's a bad idea, right? You can have that debate. But if Joe Biden was actively exciting voters, saying, I have these policies that I'm interested in, then there would be less to worry about, right? Like Joe Biden's lead could be much more stable in the sense that, or even more stable, he could prevent Donald Trump from surging in the sense that voters who want something to vote for, voters who are interested in having a vision moving forward, that they might pick Joe Biden. I worry they're just going to go with Trump again.
Yeah, on the polling as well, you can make the argument that a lot of polling places did make adjustments versus 2016 to make sure they count
Right.
in the Trump base more. And we don't have the issue with Trump supporters being scared to say who they're voting for anymore. I mean, I don't know if
Well,
you've seen it at all, but I seen these billboards on these people's houses. Like they aren't scared
yeah.
anymore.
I will say though, there was a poll that came out, I think maybe if just 2 or 3 days ago, claiming showing that more Trump supporters, and maybe we can speak on this, more Trump supporters are saying that they are worried about sort of revealing who they're going to vote for, as opposed to Joe Biden supporters saying that they're worried about they're going to vote for, almost like a 2-1 margin or something like that. Part of that, in my opinion, though, probably has to do with narrative, right? Like Trump supporters are told that that's the thing that they're supposed to like. The thing with polling that's so difficult to get is that voters will say the thing that sort of confirms the narrative in a certain sense, right? Like it's hard to know when you're actually getting a voter's actual opinion versus you're getting the opinion that they believe to be true, or the thing that they're trying to advance in a certain sense. Like it's very, very difficult to tease that sort of thing out. And so if Trump supporters are asked, do you ever feel like you're afraid to admit who you're going to vote for? They're going to say, yeah, because that's the narrative that won them the election supposedly back in 2016. So it's hard to tell. And I do agree with you. Trump supporters are very open. I saw someone running around wearing a Trump hat at the gym just, I think, like 2 days ago, which, look, rep your political person, whatever. But it is a little bit, the idea that they're afraid. I'm not necessarily buying that.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is, and do you agree with me? I've said recently, and for since the start of this year, that I think Trump has a good chance of winning, but he's gonna lose no matter what, the popular vote, by I think it might be the largest margin since probably Reagan in '85. It's gonna be a very wide margin with the popular vote for a president that still wins the electoral college. I think the thing we have to worry about in that scenario is if it causes enough civil unrest at that point to disrupt things. I'm not that worried about Trump. I'm worried about the people that Trump is motivating. The right wing militias, like in Pennsylvania, for example, right now. Peaceful protesters, and there's no rioting going on here, in Pennsylvania, are being threatened by far right militia groups. They are being, I would say terrorized in a sense that if you show up with brandishing rifles at a group of peaceful protesters, that's going, in my opinion, going against their free speech rights. At
Hmm.
that point, so there's a lot of people actively taking to the streets and making this a goal, like many content creators have said, like Tim Pool and them. They're sort of advocating and pushing and trying to incite a civil conflict, and that's what I'm most worried about in the coming years. I mean, whether Trump wins or not, is this empowerment of grassroots fascist organizations.
I am very, very concerned about that. I'm not going to lie. I am very worried about the rise of fascism. And I do always want to clarify when I use the word fascism. Fascism does refer to a very specific political movement out in the early 1900s, right? So in some respects, using the term fascist is maybe a bit of a misnomer, maybe a bit anachronistic, but it's certainly there's a lot of resemblances, right? It's certainly a species of fascism if it's not fascism outright. And I think that we do have to be very worried about that. The thing that I always go back to, though, is back in the 1960s, you could argue that there was more polarization than there is now, right? At least on the streets. There was open assassinations all over the place. The political, it seemed like society was tearing itself apart. However, if you looked at voting records by party, if you looked at Democrat versus Republican in Congress, it wouldn't appear like there was massive polarization because there was a lot of cross-party voting. Now, what's the reason for that? Of course, it's because there were Dixiecrats, there were open racists in the South who, they'd vote for whatever policy if it meant that we were making a deal in order to protect and entrench segregation and entrench racist institutions. Once that went away and we saw a massive switch in parties over the past couple of decades, now we've seen polarization not just from not just from everyday people, but we are seeing polarization in Congress as well. And it seems like our institutions, our elected institutions, our governing bodies have been absolutely incapable of handling this kind of pressure. America, more than just about any other constitutional system of government around the world, requires so much consensus in order to govern. I mean, well over 60% of senators, and senators are very undemocratically elected, a very undemocratically elected body. It requires so much consensus in order to govern that nobody ever feels like, they vote for someone, they vote for something, and nothing ever happens. And you wonder why people get alienated. You wonder why America has low voter turnout. And when you ask voters why, they say, well, it's because nothing ever gets done for me. Because our system of government just requires too much damn compromise. I think maybe loosen those holds, loosen those bars, and let politicians actually have to suffer the consequences of voting for something that they know would be terrible. I don't know. That's my opinion.
On the civil unrest thing, comparing to the 1960s, I do agree with people who say every generation thinks their crisis is going to be the end. You know what I mean? Like everyone thinks, when 9/11 happened, I'm sure the people of that generation that were, 20, 30, 40 thought, oh no, the world is falling apart, the world is going to end. When our conflicts with, the Cold War, obviously, that
Mm-hmm.
generation thought that was going to be the end. But it is, in part, we have a lot higher standards today, and we don't want to regress to a 1960s type era. And I don't think we really can. My biggest worry, which is something we haven't seen yet, is just two opposing forces meeting in a big metropolitan area where there's no other choice but them to have a conflict. And if there is a conflict, the only person who could, or the only force that could resolve that conflict is the state, which has a monopoly on violence. And I think there is a certain set of conditions we are going to that leave the possibility for a mass like casualty, mass conflict incident. And that's just what I want to sort of avoid. And of course, social media is making that worse. We live in 20 different Americas based on our social media algorithms. People don't believe things that are real. They believe everything that just makes sense to them. That's easy for them to believe. And that's when you get back around to the core of fascist ideology. It's complaining about all the problems and then saying you're going to fix them without getting too specific and relying on theatrics and like this strong sense of national pride instead of actually worrying about specific like policies. So like for example, how the National Republican or the RNC convention, their platform has nothing on it. You know what I mean? Like, did you see the RNC platform? Like, they literally said we are going to have no platform. We are just supporting Donald Trump's
Yep.
2020 goals. They're literally following fascist. Like, that is 100% leading down fascism. And Donald Trump's 2020 goals have uh, teach American exceptionalism in his 2020 goals. So this is 100% a brand of fascism. But yeah, I mean, 100% fascism is more of a, there's different branches of fascism, whether you want to
Right.
go just what there's Nazis, there's the neo Nazis, there's a wide range of ultranationalism to pay attention to. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
would seem
I
like
just think we're hitting a
it
point.
would seem like fascist is the genus, and then there's various species like Italian fascism in this specific era, and then Italian fascism in this next era, and then Nazi Germany in this era, and then Nazi Germany during the latter half, right? Like, historians and philosophers will divide it up a million different ways, and there is merit to some of that, but it is also important to have an all encompassing word for this kind of right wing nationalism that we do see absolutely resurging both in this country, but also, unfortunately, partially around the world as well, in areas where it doesn't seem like there is an alternative to capitalism. And I feel like that's part of the problem here. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of people were told that there is no alternative. That was Margaret Thatcher. Right now, that was slightly before the Soviet Union, but that was when it was very, very clear that the Soviet Union, that communism as established by the USSR, was not necessarily going to, take over the world, right? And so it was said that there was no other alternative, and this specific way became a kind of dogmatic fundamentalism, and it absolutely wrecked a lot of people's lives. It hurt a lot of people. And what do you do when you're told that there is no ideological alternative to the present order? What do you do when there's no, faith, or there's nothing to turn to? Well, you turn your nation into your religion and your state into a religion, and you worship it there. You were mentioning their massive crises. I do think that the crisis of this generation is worse than any other crisis that we've ever seen. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that the crisis of my children will be worse than the crisis that I've seen. And I hope that they'll make it through, like hopefully we make it through. But we're talking about climate change. We're talking about the catastrophe of nuclear war, which, as much as we love to think that we solved that problem, we did not. Nuclear war today is just probably as likely as it was during the Cold War, with the brief possible exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it really was, it really could have been 50-50 whether or not we made it or not. So I am worried. I really am worried that this is possibly the worst moment that we've ever seen. Now, you did mention there, I do want to touch on this. You mentioned there the RNC specifically, and how they came out saying that there's no platform and that they were just going to, push for Donald Trump. I think that that does show, actually, Joey, I think that that does show a true weakness. Like the Republican Party is worried that they're not going to win re-election, right? They were just focusing in on Donald Trump because the RNC conventions, Republican conventions, Democratic conventions, what have you, they try to do more than just nominate the president usually, right? Usually they also try to focus on congressional seats. Usually they try to focus on Senate seats that they're worried about. They try to, the House is in play, the Senate is in play, but they're focusing in only on the president because that's what they want to hammer in on. And they hope, well, maybe we can also be saved in the House and in the Senate by down ballot voting. That's their only hope at this point.
It is a really touchy point in history, and I think people, I mean, they are correct when they say every point in history seems dire, but when you look at every single factor right now, if there is an international crisis of some sort, if there's a global conflict, I truly do not know where the U.S. aligns in the grand scheme of what's
Right.
happening in the world right now, because you have, of course, the allies and axis. You have the former countries, and you have our relations right now. Let's talk modern day. So, um, Trump doesn't like the leaders of France, the UK, of anywhere in Europe or Canada, but he does show an affinity for like North Korea or Russia. And I know a lot of lefties will be like, "Oh, you can't talk about Russia because Nancy Pelosi does, so it's not a real criticism." But Russia is a far right country. Putin
Mm-hmm.
does have goals to push far right movements across the world.
That is
Trump
true.
is very much more similar to like Brazil. So you have egomaniac leading the most powerful country in the world. You have a far right operative controlling Russia. You have China, who owns the entire world's economy and can crash anything whenever they want. And then you have Europe, which is trying to maintain a union. Then I don't know where the other minor countries fit in that. But we are at a level where if there is a big catastrophe, if there's a big climate crisis, which leads to an immigration crisis, which leads to a population crisis, which leads to, there's so many issues that are going to come. And if we don't resolve these social conflicts right now, although in comparison to American history before, it's not that big of a deal compared to the civil rights movement, of course. But it is when, at this point in human history in 2020, we need to be focused on the bigger picture of humanity, of existing and of being a collective unit of some kind, or a union of some kind
Right. We
to move
need
on
to
in the
be
future.
we need to seriously be talking about building international organizations, international institutions which can transcend capital and can make sure that we can overcome the climate crisis. Without serious discussion about that, if we're only focused in on our very small national concerns and the things which only affect us here on this little speck, we're absolutely screwed. I do truly worry about that because I don't see any major vision, honestly, from any politician around the world for how we're going to be building international institutions which can allow us to live. The thing about nuclear weapons that a lot of people forget, it's not just, oh, well, we can't use nuclear weapons this century. We can't just not use nuclear weapons next century. We can literally never use nuclear weapons again. We can literally never go to war again with great powers. This can never happen again. But there's no real talk about this. There's no real talk about the fact that, like it or not, we have to move towards demilitarization in a very serious way. Doesn't mean that needs to happen overnight. It doesn't mean that we need to be unsafe while doing it, but it means that needs to be the long-term goal. And there are so few people actually having an honest conversation about that. Not even, I would say, an honest conversation about that with other people, but even with themselves. And it scares me.
Yeah, and when talking about impending crisis, I look at American history and look at this upcoming election, and this was my argument of why I decided to go from being like Bernie or bust to thinking Biden should be elected. Because when you do look at American presidents, people always turn to FDR as the progressive, as
Mm-hmm.
the model, the New Deal guy. But in reality, dude, this guy was a complete neolib who was just there focusing on policies to maintain social order and to maintain United States that wasn't going to fall to uprising. He listened to socialists. Socialists got to FDR when he had no other place to go. We could look it up about Keynes and how his economic plans, I mean, shaped what we did for the last 80 years. But he was a socialist. He went to socialists for the answer. So if there's a big crisis in the next 4 to 8 years, I do not want a fascist in power because I think neoliberals want some sense of ordinary relations. I think they will change some relations with capital in order to maintain a livable planet. So there's not too much disruption. And I think there's a global consensus around this. I mean, a guy like Barack Obama, guys like Trudeau, they're not the best for the people in their respective countries. They're not social democrats, but they are people who, if there's a crisis, I think they have a better chance of making the right decision. That's not a fascist revolution. So I think world leader wise, it is important to select who we think is going to. I mean, we're stuck in a system. There's no way we're breaking this in time.
In
Like, I
time,
don't know
yeah.
what your opinion on that is for this upcoming. We don't got to get into that conversation really,
Yeah.
but
No, well, I agree with you that we need to absolutely move to breaking the system so that we can have more choices. The analogy I love to use with people is, in some respects, people are like water. We'll fill whatever container you put us in. You put us in a two-party system where consensus is absolutely necessary in order to get absolutely everything done, anything done at all, then there's not going to be much that happens. I mean, yeah, we do. There is a human nature. There is certain things that you can't do, right? Like, you do have to work around those constraints. Certain containers won't hold water. If you have holes in a bottle, then the water is just going to go straight through, right? So there is a nature to us in the same way that there's a nature to water, but there's a lot of different containers that you can build, and we have to be talking about rewriting, in many respects, aspects of our constitution, aspects of our legal system, to make sure that people can have their will expressed, to make sure that we can be safely and effectively moving towards international coalitions. And I just wish that this conversation would even start. And I do agree with you. Who would you rather fight? This is something that David Dole has been talking a lot about on the Rational National on his YouTube channel. He's been talking about this idea of, well, who would you rather fight? Would you rather fight Donald Trump, or would you rather fight Joe Biden? Someone who at least, will say things like Black Lives Matter. He'll, what's the, I'm blanking on the exact phrase here. What is it? Hypocrisy is the homage which vice pays to virtue, right? So maybe they're a hypocrite, but they're paying you homage, and maybe that's as close as you're going to get in today, but what about tomorrow? What about the day after that? Keep fighting, keep putting pressure, and maybe things will happen. But to Donald Trump, his response to protest is law and order. His response to protest is crack it down. His response to protest is tear gas. His response to protest is to bring in the military and send the boot down. And there's a lot of people out there who's ready to lick the boot, but there's a lot of people there who he's just out to stomp and crush down on. And I do think that, we have to have a real conversation about that. And it's not just about this country. It's not just about what happens in America. It's also about what happens around the world. And I appreciate you bringing in that international perspective of our elections and who we vote for is not just about us. Whether you're Bernie or bust or not, anyone watching, it's a real question of who do we want to fight and who do we think in the long run will get us closer to our goals?
Yeah, exactly. And people, I think they lessen the impact that the U.S. has on the rest of the world. Like, if there is a fascist, which Trump is, it's always these egomaniacs who rely on theatrics. If you have that in control of the U.S., that is a giant shift for the entire world. And you have a guy advocating for conflict with China. He's not directly saying that. Tucker Carlson is. That guy from The Rising Saga, that cover, I don't know if you agree with this, but I don't like that show anymore because I think Crystal Ball isn't strong enough to deflect Saga, and I think he overpowers her, and it ends up being Democratic, crapping on
Mm-hmm.
Democrats fest. And it's like, oh, Trump, Republicans are sort of bad. But Saagar's like, yeah, still vote for Trump, and Crystal's like, don't vote for Biden. So that's just like handing the right electoral gains.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you agree with
I,
that, but yeah,
I was say I actually do still like the show in general. I agree with you that like it's not a progressive show, right?
yeah,
Um, I've always been someone actually who watches the news or reads things that I don't agree with more than I read things that I agree with, which is maybe just a weird personality quirk of mine. Like for the longest time, I was only ever subscribed to The Economist and to Foreign Affairs, The Economist being sort of right leaning, but I appreciated that they actually gave, like analysis and things like that. And it sort of spurred on my own criticisms in a certain way. So I, like I still watch the show, but I do agree with your criticisms of the show. I wouldn't say that I watch it all the time, but I watched I think like one episode this morning. But anyway, it's I'm a weird person, I guess.
yeah. And
Um,
I go through different content consumption periods, like of opinions that I want to hear at the time and that I think are valuable at the time. Like I started watching a little bit of Tim Pool to see what that was all about because I know he calls himself a liberal, but
he's
he just talks like he's falling off the right side of the political grid. But he calls himself an old lefty. I'm like, what about you? Like, about you is
he says
lefty?
he's voting for Trump, right?
Yeah. The only lefty thing he said is I hate corporations, but that's what fascists say. I mean, they say that. Just hating corporations doesn't mean you're on the left. It
Yeah,
means
that
you're
okay,
populist.
we should clarify that right now actually, cuz early fascism especially with Mussolini, you know, initially it wasn't actually all that clear whether or not he was going to be on the left or on the right. In fact, because he allied with a lot of people who were on the left. Now, nowadays, I will say the left has learned their lesson because they got burned so bad in World War II with sort of fascist rhetoric, and it was much more new at the time because it isn't it isn't sort of or I should say 18th century liberalism or 19th century liberalism or the conservatism of Burke. It's a very distinct, very different ideology than conservatism or liberalism. And so the left really was burned under Mussolini. So we have learned our lesson. But, Mussolini was able to attract a lot of leftists. And it wasn't until I think almost 8 years after he was in power that things really started turning down the bad end. I mean, we started seeing instances of it just a few years after he got into power, but it wasn't immediate. It was not immediate. And so I think that is an important lesson to remember, which is that there are in fascist trends the tendency to talk about the dangers of big business, the dangers to talk about the dangers of corporations. But then at the end of the day, they're much, much more happy to crush socialists than to try to actually crush the corporation. And they're
Yeah.
much more happy to break unions than they are to break racists, right? So And also the terrifying thing about that was also that even conservatives who would disagree with fascists in terms of rhetoric would oftentimes find socialists worse than fascists, and so would ally with the fascists. And at least this is in the case of Italy. There was a little bit of difference when it came to Nazi Germany. The breakdown was slightly different, where there were more leftists who initially opposed it, possibly because of the lessons that were going on in Italy. But anyway, we don't need to go too deep in sort of the historical nuances of it. But yeah, guys, like we do need to pay attention to that kind of stuff. There are people on the right historically and even today who will oppose corporations, who will say all the right things about being anti-tech, anti-big business, or I shouldn't say anti-tech, but no one's, I suppose, like truly anti-tech besides the sort of Luddites, but anti-big tech, right? They'll say all those right things, but then when you really break it down, they're much more interested in law and order. They're much more interested in crushing unions. They're worried about unions promoting disorder and undermining the principle of private property. These are the kinds of things that will tell you, hold on, these people aren't really with you. And we do have to pay, I think, very close attention to those kinds of things because, again, it does happen on the right.
Yeah, and if you look at Mussolini's original platform, it included workers' rights, it included healthcare, I think. Even Hitler's, like they always start with this idea of like we're all encompassing, we're just fighting for populism. Just like I used to do, I stopped doing this, but I would get a Tucker Carlson clip and make a video out of it. Like, hey, look, he's saying something good about Bernie, but he's not saying anything good about Bernie. And I think what you said about people being confused who their actual enemies are, basically what you said about different people in that time period. I think we're getting that today a little bit because I see a lot more focus from left circles on attacking neoliberals than I do with attacking fascism. And I see a lot more agreements with people that are on the far right
Mm.
because there is that disdain of corporations. But, the thing I don't like about the show Rising is they agree on the problems. But if they actually say anything about solutions, then Crystal Ball will say we need universal health care. Sauger will say we need to bomb China. Or if you talk to a lot of people, we might say we need to make sure there's a more equitable system of immigration to protect workers' rights, to make sure we don't have people coming in making slavery wages to undercut American workers. While someone on the right will say, you're right, we need to make an ethno state. Or like, they don't actually say that. But the solutions to get to the ends that we're both like searching for, I think it kind of confuses people on the left because we're like, yeah, we agree with that. We agree Bernie's getting screwed over by corporations and corporations suck. But they'll be the first ones to take over corporations, to take over the government, and we'll be the first ones that they silence if they get the chance. Like the first political prisoners in a concentration camp in history, I mean, obviously for the world wars, was socialists and communists and Democrats in Hitler's
Mm-hmm.
Germany. Those were the first people put in the concentration camps. Like I feel like they're co-opting our disdain for the system and saying, yeah, we agree with you, but they're sort of like walking us into a path that hurts us too.
Yeah, we do need to be really careful about sort of who I don't I even almost want to hesitate on terms of enemies because it's not that black and white. It's not that Manichaean.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
it is an open dialogue and there very well be very minor things that you can work with even people who you completely disagree with on for certain kinds of things, right? But it requires being careful. It requires not being tricked, right? It requires actively, I think, trying to learn about other people. And I think that that's where things start to get messy and start to get tricky. You actually do, in order to not get tricked, you actually have to learn about other ideologies. You actually do have to read into possibly fascist writings at the time of sort of Mussolini. Like, if you don't understand fascism, then you're going to get tricked by fascism. That's the point I want to make. I'm not saying like go read fascist literature and then go enjoy it, but if you don't have if you don't have any idea what fascists argued for in the past, then it's going to come around again and you're going to get confused just like a bunch of socialists did in Mussolini's Italy. Like so you do have to be absolutely careful, and you do have to be willing to watch and listen to people who you disagree with in order to make sure that you don't get tricked. People think that, well, if you watch something or you listen to something that you disagree with, then that means that you're gonna get tricked. No, that's actually how you avoid getting tricked. I mean, it requires critical thinking and it requires active engagement. Um, but if we can't ask that of people, then I'm not sure that we can ask for the future of this species, right? Like that seems like the bare minimum. Then, we're going to fail when it comes to climate change. We're going to fail when it comes to avoiding nuclear war if we can't ask critical thinking of people. I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. But I think that at least starting down that path of critical thinking is, I think, a safe bet.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are at like a crossroads when they reach a form of like realizing they're getting screwed over, where they either go more left or they go more right. They find like a rabbit hole and they see that as their solutions. And one of the biggest failings of the left, and it's not our fault. I mean, I was like barely even cognitive at that point because I was so young. But when like Obama won, he was considered left. And there was no true left in our country. There was a huge surge as a result of Bernie Sanders in 2016 using the Democratic media machine and fighting them from within their party. When we had a big populist moment in our country after Obama, we didn't have the organization yet to capture that. But the people on the far right have been in the Republican Party for a while. So they ended up just staying close, voting for Republicans over and over again, advocating for what they believe in, no matter what, no matter how crazy it is. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to build the wall. We're going to get rid of those rapists from Mexico. They're going to say all that stuff. And they were there to receive, that goodwill or disdain from the people when they were like, I'm not down with this corporate uh, politicking anymore. I'm done with this system. But the left wasn't in a position to capitalize on that yet. So I feel like having a fascist in power empowers even more of them to spread throughout the country. And this is a little bit of a hazy argument for me because I'm basically hoping that Biden gets elected in hopes that we could turn enough Democratic voters' minds away from neoliberal corporatism and show them that that doesn't work. Enough of those minds
Mm.
to turn so we don't
Okay, I
get
see your
another
argument.
right-wing populist. But I mean, I go back and forth between thinking, like, I debated the last outlaw a little bit on the Bernie or bust thing on voting for Biden or not, and his argument is essentially we need to show people Democratic politics doesn't work, like neoliberal politics doesn't work, by them losing to Trump, and then yell at them from the outside. But I think it'll actually help us if we get Biden in office and then beat him up and show people why he sucks so much when he goes back on Medicare, lowering the Medicare age, or goes back on a public option, or doesn't do enough for climate change.
Right.
Show people that doesn't work, because that's what happened after Obama. That's when we got the biggest leftist movement of all time. So show them Joe Biden doesn't work, because I think having Trump in office naturally scares people, and I don't think people are going to go left when they're scared. I feel like that's more of a thing if you're enlightened, if you have a chance to look further and you have a more global perspective. I think when people get scared, they either run like to Trump, to the powerful stuff, or they are more likely just to say, okay, I want anything but Trump. Like I feel like it's going to be another just not Trump election in 2024. So I mean, I go back and forth on this all the time. We don't have much data on it, but
Yeah, I mean it is a lot of sort of theory. It's hard to tell exactly how that would go out. I will say that there was this massive backlash theory when it came to Donald Trump last time around, right? I think we even saw people like Slavoj Žižek arguing, well, yeah, Trump should get in, and then there's going to be a massive backlash, and then there's going to be an uprising, for the left. And clearly that wasn't what we saw. We saw a lot of voters in the primary who were afraid, saying that their number one concern was electability, and then they voted, of course, for the centrist because of the years and years and years of propaganda which told people that the centrist, the more moderate person, is always going to be the more electable person. Sometimes that may be the case, sometimes, but not always. But there was this idea, because of how we've been taught to think about politics as a just left right spectrum, that intuitively it was, well, obviously the more moderate person is going to be the more electable. And so electability just became an argument for corporatism. So I don't know that the whole backlash approach, the idea that, well, if we vote in Donald Trump, then it's going to teach a lesson to the Democratic Party, or that it's going to, create a massive backlash and uprising of leftism. We haven't seen that. We just haven't seen that. And I get worried that a lot of people think that that's definitely what would happen. I don't see much evidence to think that that would happen. Now, I will say one other point. You were mentioning there about how initially with Obama we didn't have sort of the leftist grassroots movement built up, right? Where it took a long, long time, and it took years when it came to Bernie Sanders. It took the Occupy movement. I do think that we're starting to see fruits of that. I am slightly optimistic when I look at the trends for young people, people my age, people our age, right? That we're a lot of us are very optimistic that we can actually really change things, even if we're pessimistic in terms of our future and the economy and how things are going. A lot of young people are very much so on the left. Not everybody, but a lot more than older people. And I talk to people my age all the time. I'm talking to you. Like, a lot of people are literally just like, oh yeah, well, obviously Bernie Sanders was the way to go. Like, duh. And that'll be just sort of the kind of moderate position in a certain sense. So I am optimistic in that respect. And we did see a lot of people sort of trained up during the Occupy movement, moving in, who were very young during the Occupy movement, moving up, starting up into Bernie Sanders campaign a few years later. And then now people who worked with Bernie Sanders campaign moving on to work with other progressives and work with other people. And work with other progressives going into Congress. So I do think that there is a possibility for a real movement and a real change. The thing that I do get worried about, though, is that there aren't the kind of specific policy platforms that we're going to really need in order to truly move forward as a country, where it's not just, well, I want this thing, that thing, and the other thing. It's also about, well, what institutional arrangement do we want to make sure that the kinds of problems which voters see in front of them are the kinds of problems, and the sort of solutions that they intuit are the kinds of ones which are going to move towards solutions towards climate change, move towards solutions when it comes to nuclear disarmament, move towards solutions when it comes to building an international workers' coalition of some kind. And I get worried that sometimes we can get bogged down on all the massive problems that we have when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to, making sure that everybody can just have basic decency and decent access to education, that we get sort of, that these are the only problems that people are ever going to see. And I think that we have to move towards talking about international fixes. And I don't know. I mean, we were talking about that maybe a little bit earlier, but I think that some of this stuff does come full circle.
Yeah, I don't agree with the strategy of just making the Dems lose again, owning the libs, because I feel like, I mean, I know that if a lot of these moderate Democrats didn't outright hate like black people, they would be Republicans. Like a lot of people I know are complete fiscal conservatives. They just believe that Black Lives Matter, for example. So I think if the Democratic Party loses, I think they'll just continue to go to the right. I don't want to lose our position that like guys like Bernie fought his entire life to get as an influence sector in the Democratic Party. We aren't breaking this system down anytime soon with the two-party system, and all the people advocating for revolution are insane. If there's a revolution in the
Whoa,
United States,
fighting words.
no, like an actual revolution, who think accelerationism is the way to go, like we need
Hmm.
integration of society, so people realize that we're right. Are you kidding me? This country is like this right now, and this is, I don't know, it's to the right for you too, right? Our country's like this. If this thing falls, it's collapsing on the right side. We don't
Hmm.
have nearly the influence we need yet, for the leftist party or whatever to take
I
over.
do agree that if there was like an actual revolution or civil war, like the left would definitely lose in this country
Yeah.
right now. I do agree with that. I will say, one other thing. You are right to hone in on who the Democrats are really trying to target when it comes to the suburbs, right? And also when it comes to what I found super interesting when it comes to the RNC specifically is how they were trying to respond to get to losing the suburbs. We saw, for instance, the McCloskeys come out waving their guns around, and it was,
uh,
real, and they were coming back all dressed up in their sort of, very fancy home, right? And they were the ones who argued concern. They were saying, well, what about single family home zoning, right? They were making those cases and talking about how undesirables would come into their community, how, and saying that it would destroy the suburbs, right? So their solution to the fact that they are starting to lose the suburbs, the Republican Party, is to lean into racial dog whistling, concerns about undesirables, concerns about poor people moving into the suburbs, and destroying the suburb way of life. But the ironic thing about that is, of course, the reason why the Republican Party has been losing the suburbs so much is, as you point out there, because they may agree with the claim Black Lives Matter, but they still want tax cuts. And so for them, the Republican Party, to respond to losing the suburbs by, leaning into racial dog whistling, I think is exactly the wrong way to go, especially when you're talking about voters who are oftentimes highly educated voters that were, those are the voters that the Republican Party is really losing. Those are the kinds of voters who are more likely to be plugged in and to be paying attention to those little kinds of details. I think that the Republican Party strategy of how they're trying to lean into try to win the suburbs is, in my opinion, probably doomed. I think that they're leaning into the very thing that caused them to lose the suburbs in the first place, because that used to be a lock. Like it or not, that was a lock for Republicans for the longest time. But now they're starting to lose it, oftentimes over racial issues.
Yeah, and it is sad to say, but a lot of these people we're talking about, like I said, people in the suburbs that believe in like BLM, they'll say that, but if they see a black person move into their communities, they'll probably go, "Honey, they're coming," or something like that. Like this racism is so deeply ingrained in our society. This Donald Trump talk still works. I just think the left, we need more time before there's a big event. We need more time to gain more influence. And we know we got the young people. We need more
Mm-hmm.
and more young people getting of age to vote. And I hate to say this, but we need more and more old ideologies to die off. It's simply how it is. Old people, the boomer generation, is what's keeping us back. Like they're the ones that are leading us to our ultimate decay as as a civil society right now. So we need more time to get more people moving, more young people involved, and we just aren't there yet. If there was like a big enough third party to challenge the two-party system, I mean, it's not going to come yet. Like we don't have more than 5 to 10% of the country who would even consider not voting for Biden that's a Democrat. Like in the Democratic Party, I think people underestimate how much out of Bernie's 30 to 35% support was mainstream Democrats who just realized this, this guy cares about people. He's right. The system is crooked. They aren't all socialists. I think like going on Twitter, going on Facebook, like whatever apps people are on, I think being in these spaces where they're only talking to leftists, I think the amount of the United States who actually adheres to this ideology is overestimated by a lot of
Mm.
people we agree with. And we need more time to show people that we're right. And I just don't think we're there yet.
There are interesting polls suggesting that a lot of young people are open to socialism, right? Like, because that's, I will agree with you on that point, on part of that point specifically, which is that on Twitter you'll see a lot of socialist people. Even like I think that when I was younger, I would tweet this out in favor of socialism and the like. I would tweet out those polls showing young people that more young people are open to the idea of socialism as opposed to open to the idea of capitalism. But there's a massive gulf of difference between someone saying that they're open to the word or that they have a less negative opinion of the word socialism as opposed to the word capitalism, right? There's a big gulf of difference there. But that does mean that there's opportunity to educate. It does mean that there's opportunity to teach people, as you point out there, teach people what you mean, to share those ideas, to dialogue those ideas, and show people how, look, your problems that you are facing in your life right here right now could be fixed by this, that, and the other policy. And those ideas, these ideas oftentimes are portrayed as abstract or obtruse or unrelevant or unserious, but show people how they are serious ideas, how they can fix your life
Yeah.
here and now. And I think that
And
that's the first step there.
there's polling I saw that shows, I think it's from the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, where 75% of the Democratic Party has a positive view of socialism. And if they have a positive view of socialism, they have a great view of simple governmental programs. Because I think people don't know what socialism actually means. Even if you agree
Yeah,
with it, I don't think you know what that means exactly.
unfortunately, yeah.
While, socialism's approval went down in the Republican Party, it went up with independents a little bit, but government being involved in things like healthcare shot up for everyone. So even if people think they're against socialism or government powers by the people operating on behalf of the people, as much as they think they're against it, a lot of people are growing accustomed to thinking that way. And we don't need Republicans for this particular goal. For us to be successful in this system, we need social Democrats to be the majority in the Democratic Party. We need to take control of one of these two power structures in the United States, or there's no way we're going to create any change in time and at the level that we need it to. Because once we get control of the Democratic Party, if we could convince more than half of the Democratic Party that someone like Bernie, someone like AOC, who's extremely popular with Democrats, that they're the people with the answers, at that point, we can control this Democratic media monster. And I'm not saying we'll ever get to the point where we're actively taking bat at capital and the control capitalism has on our system, but we will be at the point where we can actually be social Democrats and move the Democratic Party left at that point. But we have to win this thing on the ground. We can't rely on the mainstream media. If I were if I were in control of everyone's minds on the left, I would say don't make another tweet about mainstream media unless if you have a video up and you're disproving them. Don't give a crap about what they're doing. Worry about building our independent media programs. Worry about volunteering somewhere. Worry about getting on the ground and contacting or talking directly to people. Share your favorite leftist commentator that tells the news. Do that kind of stuff. Stop even looking or wasting your time with MSM because they're never going to help us. Let's get our people on there to talk and pay attention to that. But other than that, focus on like what we're building. You know what I mean? Because I don't think this power structure is ever going to be nice to us. I think we have to go from the ground and win it over ourselves.
Yeah, we have to talk about rebuilding and reimagining power structures, both in terms of reforming power structures which also exist, but also building new ones, building new alternative systems of media. We can't just rely and sort of focus so much on criticizing the mainstream media, except for to, point directions for how we can build our own alternatives, how we can build our own systems which can compete with the mainstream media and can, and really fight them back. So I definitely agree with you there. I think that's a good first step for sure.
Yep.
So thanks so much, Joey, for joining us and chatting, guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with us in the stream here.